Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the next workshop presented to you by Orish Puri in the Debate Central, Global Speech and Debate Council, and the Debating WhatsApp community. We're very glad to have you on board here. I'm Kaushik, and I'm going to be the one who's facilitating this session on prep time strategies for debate. On prep time strategies for debate. So, a bit about me. I'm Kaushik. I'm somebody who's been loving debating for a very long time. And why this session is essentially that I've seen that a lot of people often have problems working around how to manage and utilize prep time, what kind of strategies to employ, and also I've been asked quite frequently what kind of different things can you do to make prep time better. So, just a few caveats before we begin the session as well. I think the first important thing to consider is that this session is not generally solely for like identifying every possible strategies or outcomes out there, but it's rather just like a precursor towards understanding what are some of the aspects that you can cover and understand from how you can be better at identifying things that you can do when you're prepping for any debate round. There are also different strategies that you need to employ when you're doing different debate tournaments because British parliamentary debates have probably shorter prep times and much more dynamic requirement for prep for opening teams and for closing teams and probably nations. And also there are certain formats like World Schools and Lincoln Douglas public speaking and other places where there might be a lot of like differences because there might be some places where you have prepared rounds, there might be some places when you have different expectations from the way in which it is operating and so on. So take whatever is being taught as general principles as to what are good practices to take into consideration when doing preparation for your like particular format that you're trying to go ahead and speak for. The three main pillars that we'll be prioritizing to build upon is one, speed, which is efficiency, which is to look at how quickly you can generate and structure arguments. So the three main prongs depend on how well the utility of the prep time is going for you, and secondly, how well the application of your prep time is, and thirdly, how well you're probably going to go ahead and like juxtaposition your speeches with the content that you're discussing during your prep time. So when we're discussing speed and efficiency, it is very important to note here that there is always a lot of potential that people often like think that they have too much time or too little time and they don't really know how to regulate or pace themselves when they're preparing their strategy for doing prep time. Um, Considerations, and also in terms of discussing and spacing out themselves properly, that what time do you need to have for like thinking of arguments by yourself, and what kind of like discussions you need to have with your teammate, and how much time do you allocate for it. So firstly, it is very important to like maintain your speed and how you are going to go ahead and like approach these particular aspects. The second thing, which is also what we'll be discussing more in detail later, is depth, or how the quality of your prep time is. You have to be like very well reasoned and also like very well evidenced when you're promoting your arguments, in terms of also how you're presenting your case and how you're like structuring those arguments. You need to be careful in considering what their impacts are, how well built they are, how structurally sound they are, and how they flow from one team mate to the other. For instance, if there are three speakers in an Asian format, how does the structure of the speech look like from the first speech to the third speech, and so on. So I think that becomes an important consideration in thinking about different critical strategies which might help you better yourself and also like outlive what kind of necessary issues might come up when opponents are like presenting their cases as well. So discussing things like in depth helps you critically do a lot of things, firstly being that you're safeguarded against potential pitfalls when you've not like considered certain things well, because often there might be certain curveballs that are thrown to you from the opposition team that you need to be very wary about or careful about. And I think that is something that you need to be very considerate of as well. The second thing that you need to be very careful on in terms of depth and quality is also to understand what kind of like nuances are there in terms of what what you say and what it means and how it impacts the burden of proof and the way in which it is meant to be looked at in terms of their motion. So we'll be discussing certain strategies around how to do that better in terms of your prep time as well. The last of the three iron pillars is scope in terms of predicting what the opposition's case is. So often teams do not really consider that preparation time is not just like a strategy consideration for what you are covering and how you are going to go ahead and deal with issues and material, but rather it's also like juxtapositioning your arguments in terms of what you believe might come around from the opposition's case. So it means that you need to be good at anticipating what the potential arguments might be, or what the potential refutations or rebuttals might be for your own argumentation, and that becomes an important consideration in terms of how you're structuring your debate arguments as well. There are multiple reasons why this is relevant, because one, when you are looking at what are the potential things that teams can scope you out on, or might be potentially looking at breaking you down on, you can then automatically build that into your argumentation, which means that it is better off for you when you are like preparing your notes and you're preparing your case, that you have discussions around what might be the proper responses that might come from the opposition team regarding it, which might mean that there might be certain scope for them to break down what you're accurately trying to represent. So this helps you become A, mentally prepared, but B, also it might help you become like stay one step ahead of what the other team might propose or might want to like do in terms of the round. All of these things are equivalent and important between the three pillars: speed, scope, and depth, because it becomes very nuanced at one point, because people don't really strategize about what prep looks like. They don't really think critically about what prep should do for you. They rather like give out what prep should be or not in terms of how it is. So what I mean by this is simple, because sometimes people take a very lackadaisical attitude about how prep can be utilized. Sometimes they go in very anxious, sometimes they go in very like phased about, all right, what might I get out of this conversation with my teammates? What might I come around with in terms of argumentation? And I've seen like a lot of people have problems, be it from people I've trained in university or be it from people I've been training in schools. There have often been a lot of problems in terms of discussing different narratives and discussing different aspects of how to deal with these issues. But what helps indirectly is sort of like looking at the key fabrics of what underpins your positives, which means that if your team has certain strengths in terms of certain material, for example, if you might be better at economics or you might be better at certain themes over than your other teammate, that might be something that you need to consider while debating. There might be other considerations also that you are thinking about when you're debating, like what are the possible pitfalls of arguing from a social perspective or an economic perspective, and then discuss that. And also, there's like a lot of things that might make you feel anxious, but it often or not is better that you have a calm or rational mind when you're going ahead and doing prep. This helps because I've seen this nervousness derail a lot of teams when they are doing like casework for their own argumentation, and prep becomes very important in how parliamentary debating, or rather any public speaking or debating activity, occurs around the world, right? Why is that? Because as a judge and having judged so many tournaments, I've often seen that if people are underprepared or underwhelmingly short selling their own case, it is very clearly evident that they've not anticipated or discussed certain things which are predominantly important from probably the opponent's case or probably from your own possibility of argumentation, being taken into account when you're actually prepping. And this is so painfully like obvious that it becomes a sore point in how you structure your speeches, because sometimes it means that your speeches are not as impactful, sometimes it means that your speeches are not yet that helpful, and how you deal with it or not deal with it becomes something like a relevance issues. So it's always best to be careful around how streamlined your approaches are and how like discursive and detailed your approaches towards these issues are in terms of how you're prepping for it. And that is what the entire purpose of this particular session is all about, in terms of like preparing you for dealing with scopes of what prep time should cover, but also in terms of how you can better yourself with each passing like activity that you do around preparation, but also in terms of how you are preparing, but also in terms of how you are preparing your casework in general. So let's go right into it. So this workshop is divided into a couple of phases. The first phase is the motion deconstruction. I think a lot of teams undersell this point because all of the motions have certain things that are very important and certain things that are very intrinsically necessary when you're looking at them, right? And I think this becomes relevant in the sense that what you want to do in terms of the presentation you have for the material you want to discuss. So the first step is you need to probably identify the motion type. So, for example, if it's a policy motion or a value motion or a factual motion, an example of a policy motion would be this house would be banning lobbying. So, what this helps from the first period of time is that for a policy motion, you are proposing a specific actionable change. So you must also be required to present a model or a plan. So that becomes very important for you to consider this during your preparation time as well. That if this is a policy motion, a model is a must, and that's something that you really need to consider when you're going ahead and doing your argumentation. So that's the first thing that you need to probably consider a lot more of. The second thing, or the second type of motion rather, is the value motion, which is this house believes that security is more important than liberty, for example. So here you're arguing a moral or philosophical preference. For example, you are debating upon what kind of necessary value judgments or value calls those actors or those individuals or the community or the people who this motion dictates to would be taking in terms of that case. So here you don't specifically need a model, but a clear criterion, like what would be the standard for judgment. What this means essentially is that there are two values that are contrasting in terms of a debate, for example. One might be that you are probably discussing from one point of view the value of what's liberty looking like in a positive sense and what's liberty looking like in a negative sense. So it's important to consider here the two perspectives of a positive or a negative difference, because in value motions or value judgment motions, what happens sometimes is the teams forget to assess what value they're being judged on, and that motion reading is something which is woefully lacking at times when people don't really understand what essentially they want to deal with in terms of the framework of what that value is. The last type is the factual motion, which is, for example, the South's belief that globalization has failed. So, what you're doing in a factual motion is you're arguing that a statement is true or false. Here, your arguments would make the case rest entirely on evidence and analysis. Rather than, say, judging on, say, more undefined terms like values or how you set your standards for judging values, a factual motion makes a lot more like impetus or a lot more consideration on evidence and analysis in terms of understanding what kind of like differences exist, what kind of benefits exist, and what kind of narrative changes are required to exist for those issues that have been disclosed by the operation of those facts or the operation of the reality that the history has shown you to make a considerable like foot peg for you to like go ahead and do better. I think that becomes an important concern for factual motions. So here you have to be very specific in analyzing and giving proper like diction or proper like narration as to what kind of changes and what kind of like necessary benefits or harms are there. But you also need to sort of like think about what kind of points could be better dealt with, or what kind of points could be better like nuanced out when thinking about things that have occurred factually in the world. So these three types are very different from what they need from you. A policy motion would need a model, a value motion would not need a model, a factual motion would need evidence and analysis, a value motion would need a standard for judging the value system that you're basing the debate on. So the first step is, of course, then to identify correctly what type of motion is there, and then to apply that particular identity to the way in which you are talking about what you are presenting as material. The second step is defining the key terms when you're prepping. The first ambit of this is the definition. We always have to be very careful when you're defining subjects in a particular debate. You can't be very uncharitable. You can't geoset, which means you can't place set a particular motion, or you can't time set a particular motion unless that geosetting or place setting has already occurred in the framing of the motion itself. So what it means is that you have to be a charitable towards all the sides in the debate. You have to be fair, you have to be clear, and you have to make it debatable. A debate is a comparative sport. You have to always be considerate in terms of how you're presenting your material between different individuals and different segments. So you can't always rely on this idea that you can squirrel yourself out and then say that, right, this definition is the only one that stands because it's the definition that I'm mentioning. That's not really a fair debate. What I mean by squirreling here is the term that I'm using right now is very important to consider. Squirreling is the ambit that you're restricting a motion towards a way in which it's not meant to be, or you're trying to narrow down the definition of the motion to make it more favorable to you when it's not supposed to be narrowed down to that extent. So the reason why this is an important consideration is a that you have to be very careful in how you are like presenting your material, but also in terms of reasonableness of how you're debating. You can't be unfair and say that if I'm squirreling the motion, why am I not winning the case automatically if the other team has challenged my definition? Because I don't think that is way important in term that is like weighed importantly in your favor, because that's not one allowed in terms of how debating operates, but also in terms of how things should be fair and clear. It's not a possible thing. So that being said, the background of a definition, the definition should have a couple of other things that go for it apart from being fair, clear, and debatable. The reasonable person test would be the second standard that you will apply when you're defining key terms. Here, you would probably think about an average informed person looking at this definition and accepting it to be true. So, this could mean that you could define emotion in a way in which it makes sense to people not really specifically involved in the particular field. So, for example, if you're debating on economics or you're debating on law, you might have specific knowledge because you're from a legal background or an economic background, but it doesn't mean that that specified knowledge is something that you should be applying to squirrel or gerrymander the motion, or which simply means that you should not define it in an obscure or self serving way. Now, once this particular step has been done, or the particular reasonable test has been passed, you go ahead and identify the sticking point, which is the most single contentious term in the motion. For example, if you were debating on this house would ban harmful speech, the entire debate will hinge on the definition of what harmful looks like in terms of speech. Sometimes I've seen that debaters, and in recent tournaments also that I've had the opportunity to judge at, that debaters often fail to identify the nuances of a motion itself. The nuances means that the wording of the motion is often ambiguous or left something, or is left to some device or tool which does not really serve the purpose that the motion is meant to, and therefore it is not really understood clearly or debated clearly in that sense. What it often does is that even if your arguments might seem meaningful or reasonable or impactful, it doesn't automatically mean that those particular things are tangentially beneficial or maybe a very important personification of what needs to be done in that particular motion. So even if you think that you're reasonable, even if you think that that's something that is important or considerate or something that is going to be defining or beneficial, it might be just as well unimportant or non-charitable in that sense. So you have to be very careful that that you're careful in identifying the sticking point of the motion, which means that you are also careful in identifying what the burdens of the motion are and what you're actually intended to debate upon, and that when you're framing your arguments and concerns or you're defining key terms, you don't go beyond what the bounds of the motion would intend for you to cover in that motion itself. Now, the next aspect is establishing the burden of proof. There are a couple of things that need to be looked at when the establishment of the burden of proof is being discussed. For the proposition, the requirements is to A, prove that a significant problem exists or the status quo is flawed. And secondly, they need to present a clear, viable policy or a model in terms of if the debate motion needs it. Three, they need to prove the policy would solve the problem or what is the solvency of what you're stating to the problem that you're stating. And fourthly, the benefits which would outweigh the harms, if any, and what the net benefit therefore would look like. The opposition, on the other hand, has to defend the status quo sometimes in terms of how the motion is framed, or prove that the policy is flawed, ineffective, or prove the harms of the policy outweigh the benefits, which is the disadvantages, or in certain types of motions, propose a counter model. Since this is not really a types of motion breakdown, I will not be discussing what essentially a counter model should look like and in what motion types a counter model is required. I will also probably not be able to cover what kind of like aspects do these disadvantages and other issues look like. So this would probably need you to look at some other resources which we have also like shared and we have also covered as workshops in terms of what these counter models or what these policy disadvantages could look like. So just discussing some examples based on the motion this house would implement a universal basic income. From the proposition side, you have to prove the current welfare employment systems are failing, and you have to say that a UBI model, for example, like $1,000 a month, is feasible, and that the UBI will alleviate poverty and economic anxiety, for instance, as to why that policy is required. And fourthly, the benefits of health stability, which outweigh the cost or inflation risks that come around from it, which discusses the four-step framework that we discuss about proposing the burden of proof for your prep time. Now, this is relevant because UBI is not something which is currently part of the status quo. So you need to then for discuss what current welfare and employment systems look like and why they're failing, which is the general status quo of most of the world right now. So, in the opposition end, you would probably discuss the policy being economically catastrophic. For example, you might discuss how inflation increases, what happens for labor issues, and how it might make less sense because you take away the philosophical reward, risk reward, and effort reward narrative, but also how like different policies can become better outcomes in this particular narrative. So that's how you sort of like identify and prove what the things that you need to discuss in the debate are. The second phase is about argument generation. There are a couple of ways in which I would discuss this. The first one is the PESEL checklist, which I would give a lot of like different credits for. It's not complete, it's not holistic, but I think there are a couple of things that I've seen that people face issues with when they're going ahead and generating argumentation. And prep time is something that novices alike and also like serious debaters alike sometimes face a lot of like issues thinking about different arguments, different frameworks, and how to tie back their arguments and frameworks into discussion. So there are a couple of strategies that I would recommend following through with, which helps you like give a lot of thought about what can be argued, what are better ways of arguing certain things, and what are different ways in which you can generate arguments, right? So the PESEL checklist is the way in which you can think about how new considerations for your points can or your burdens can be, or what you can look like in term or what the world could look like in terms of how you want to debate that particular model or that particular motion in that sense. So, the PESEL checklist covers political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental issues. So, when you're going through this checklist, what you do is you look at these different like issues in terms of how does it tie back into the questions you ask for your motion. So, for instance, if you're looking at political issues in terms of the PESEL checklist, you need to ask the questions about how does this affect state power, how would it affect governance, how does it affect political stability or international relations, or questions of a similar nature where political issues are being discussed at the forefront, which could simply also mean what is like the balance of powers between the legislative, judiciary arms as well as the executive arms of the government, and also the fourth pillar of democracy. How does that look like in terms of the political considerations of it, which is the media? So what this does is, for example, if you look at the last motion which we discussed for the burden of proof, which is that this house would implement a universal basic income, you could say that in terms of governance, it could mean that an added administrative issue was being presented where more politically separate machinery is to be employed in like fulfilling the UBI, but that also a lot of administrative power is going there, which means that a lot of like political functions are sometimes having to take away its economic mobility or its economic powers to go ahead and like make this thing like UBI a reality in the world or in the ground at that point. So this could simply also mean that there might also be different problems where states having like more populations can have more amount of money going from the center if this is a thing that has been modeled to be from the central government or the federal government. So this could mean that there are certain states getting more amount of like economic mobility, which means that state power is affected, governance is affected in that sense. So there are a lot of ways in which you can get questions which you, if you think about the answers to those questions, you get like a lot of interesting points which you can debate in terms of emotion. So we'll consider the same motion when we're looking at the other things in the PESEL checklist as well, and thinking about different criterions and examples. So the second thing about, say, like the economic aspect, you can think about what are the costs, what are the benefits, what are the impacts on the market, what are the effects on labor or wealth distribution. So if you have UBI, you could automatically think that the cost would be significant if people are largely below a certain degree of poverty or a certain degree of income, rather. So this means that there might be a huge amount of cost to the government. So that means that a significant amount of tax money from the government is going into like providing for the universal basic income, which means that a lot of like other policies would need to sort of be balanced out. Why? Because considering that there is not an infinite amount of resources, there would be some amount of like judging of what priorities are there, and also like balancing what kind of economic actions you can take, which means that there are certain things that you will be prioritizing, certain things that you will be deprioritizing, and there would be certain impacts that you will be looking at in terms of things. This could also mean that there are certain qualitative ways in which labor forces can utilize the universal basic income. A, that it could mean that it gives a social security, so the people have less physiological, physical, and psychological strain, which means that there might be a happier workforce and people might want to work better. Or it might also at the same time mean that people would be willing to work less because they have a security in terms of some amount of income, which means that they might be lethargic in terms of finding jobs in the first place. So automatically, this gives us like two facets on which we can sort of like think about this motion. The third aspect being social, is how does the impact look towards communities, culture, public health, education, or individual rights. Again, taking the same motion as an example. For individual rights, you could say that people have the right to life, people have the right to live with dignity, people should be given the basic necessities from the government. So that could discuss individual rights. It could also mean that if people have universal basic income, they can enjoy the culture of the communities that they're present in, or the public health facilities are a bit better, which means that it overall helps the community in general. So, from the social perspective, also, you can think of different points. So, I'll go through the next three a bit more quickly because, of course, it follows the same trajectory, asking questions, getting the answers towards those questions through certain perspectives that those motions would highlight, and then applying them to create argumentations. So, technological would mean that what is the role of technology in this? Is it a driver of the problem or a mechanism for the solution? For legal, you could look at if it is violating constitutions or treaties or established legal precedent. For environmental, you could probably say what are the ecological or resource based impacts, what are the human nature conflicts, and other things which are going on ahead for it. So, not all of these six aspects can always uniformly apply, nor do these take precedence in all cases. Certain motions have certain factors which are more important. For example, on a motion about universal basic income, economics is always going to be a much bigger ascertaining factor and an important factor in considering different arguments and the different genesis of those arguments and the way those arguments are presented or like thought of. So I think that is also something that you have to be very careful about when you are going ahead and thinking about what to prioritize and what to first look for within the special checklist as well. So I'm pretty sure that even novices or anybody else for that matter, if they're applying these thought processes very rationally, they'll always be able to have the right answers in terms of identifying what they want to and identifying what kind of like arguments they can run for any kind of motion. The next aspect is the five W's and one H formula. I discuss this quite frequently with people I know. The five W's are who, what, why, where, when, and the sixth is how. So, who talks about stakeholders and actors? So, it helps in identifying the groups most affected by the arguments that you're trying to raise. What discusses the mechanism and scope, which means that what is the clear specific action that you want to be taken, what the exact change that you want to be proposed, and what is the scope of the problem or solution. Why is again the significance. All of these six sort of give structure and nuances to the argument that you're trying to raise. If you ask these 6 questions at any point for your argument building, will always build a stronger argument. So, in why, the significance, which is establishing the inherent value or reasons for why the arguments matter in the first place, or why the judge should care, or what is the impact. Where means how, in the sense that in what location or in what context, situational or geographical context, is this operating upon? And will this policy work in a developing economy but fail in a developing one? So the context is equally as important, and it becomes really important to consider different aspects or perspectives from where this debate can lie, and which is also something that is very important to consider when you're prepping. When is timeline and urgency? Is the impact going to be immediate? Is the impact going to take some time to be realized? Is there a long term issue? Is there a slow moving issue? Which might determine the type of harm or benefit. And lastly, the how is implementation and feasibility as to what is the process of making it work. So these two, the PESTLE and the 5 Ws and 1 Hs, are for me substantially important considerations in discussing different formats, but also a robust way in which you can generate arguments during your principles being discussed during prep time, and are short methods in which prep times are given better clout for them. Let's take a 5 minute break before we move on to the second half. So we've discussed the two aspects of consideration of debating argument generation, but there are two ways in which we need to also look at how to create more robust arguments from those particular aspects of thinking about how arguments or what arguments to run. The two frameworks are the ARE framework, which is assertion, reasoning, and example. Assertion is stating your point, refutation or reasoning is stating an attack, and extension evidence is the proof. So this framework, as well as the CWI framework, claim, warrant, impact, which is what is the criteria or scope, what is the urgency or warrant of why you need to do this, and what is the impact or value. What it means is that it gives you a better argument which affects better scope of people, or give you a better consideration of the scope of impact and what the necessities are. And warrants would give you what is more certain to occur, what is more urgent, what is reversible, what is more considerate in terms of the changes in necessity. And impacts would drive or argument links back to the debate's fundamental values. So all judges are looking for in good debate material is what you can compare well and where you can prove your point better than the other team. And also, most importantly, how you are proving impacts beyond reasonable doubt, and why your impacts stand till the end of the debate, and why your impacts are the most reasonable and the most necessary to consider as the framework of the motion would need it to. I think in those considerations, the PESTLE framework that we've discussed, as well as the 5 Ws in 1H and the ARE and CWI framework, are important considerations in delivering what kind of like necessary footwork and changes you need to make in terms of delivering better criterias and better analysis of these aspects. So you have to be careful when you're doing these things also, because of course these are easy to speak of but harder to implement. You need a lot more practice when you're going ahead and doing this to become better at it from time to time. So don't ever like think that you are not doing well at the first end, so you're not going to be able to do it in a long consideration of how you are operating in that particular time frame. It will need some time, but you will be eventually getting there where you're getting better at implementing it and doing it. So it's not really that big of a scope of concern if you're saying that there is not really a lot of time for you to take deal with material of that sense. There are a couple of other things that you would look like when you're looking at how arguments are prioritized and how you're constructing them. We've already identified what kind of arguments we can run, the length, the breadth, and the depth of consumption of how different materials or how like different things can be spoken of in terms of material relevance, but also in terms of what is valuable to present in terms of the motion from our argument generation discussions. But argument generation is nothing without prioritizing argument and what means more and what is more important. So we are not supposed to select arguments which are based on like personal preferences. There are three irrefutable ways in which argument selection should occur. First is you need to look at the strength or how logically sound it is. Second, you need to look at the relevance or how central it is to proving your burden. Third, you need to look at defensibility or how easily can it be refuted or not. Choose arguments that are harder to attack in that sense. If you're not choosing arguments that are logically sound, which means that if its strength is weak, it is a waste of time. If you're choosing argument that is not relevant, it is again not something that judges consider high on their sheets, and it's not helping you move the needle anywhere for your own case. And if it is something that can be easily rebutted and is not something that is structurally built up better from the ARE and CWI frameworks, it means that it is not easy for you to defend, and it also would mean that you're wasting time in your speeches building that argument, but also it doesn't really move the needle for you in terms of like winning the judges sheets over for your side. The way in which you can like prioritize this and make it better is the CERI construction model, or what I would like to say, the claim, evidence, and reasoning and impact. So every argument must be in and of itself a contained self-contained unit, or a complete self-contained unit. The claim is probably the one liner or the assertion, as we call it, or headline of your point, like this policy is a regressive tax on the poor, for example. The evidence or the explanation is the logical or proof of to why it is true or why it is to be considered. This depends on what kind of format you're doing. If it's a prepared debate, you go ahead and present data. If it is not, you speak from relevance and well reasoned positions. Thirdly is reasoning, the logical link between how does the evidence prove the claim, like this data would demonstrate that. And lastly, impacts, the so what or why does this argument matter, like the impact is a 15% rise in poverty for our most vulnerable, or the impact directly is that poorer people don't have access to resources, which proves the relevance of your arguments. What we do here is we prove the strength from the claim and the evidence. We prove the relevance from the reasoning aspect and the impact aspect. And we also ensure that it is defensible by ensuring that the evidence and explanation and reasoning is well rounded and well sounded out. The third phase, after dealing with everything around argument formation and argument generation, is to think about what the opposition can do to you during prep or steel manning the opposition. Do not strawman your cases, which means that you do not need to waste prep time for weak or foolish arguments. If you were thinking about what kind of arguments is easier to run or more persuasive, think about it in this sense. You have to ask yourself, if I were the most intelligent, prepared, and persuasive debater on the other side, what would my 3 to 4 star arguments be from the opposition? Use the PESTLE framework here again, but for the opposition side, write down those main arguments which come from them and identify what is the core place of clashing between their argumentation and yours. This would reveal to you like 2 or 3 fundamental problems between each sides, which you will try to like look at, which is essentially or fundamentally the clashes that is happening between the two sides, which is where the debate will be won or lost if you are to win that particular round. So, for example, let's go back to the UBI debate again. If the core clash is to be understood, it will most likely be the economic efficiency versus the moral obligation of doing this particular aspect. So, your preparation time would probably be better focused on winning that particular specific clash. So, let's look at some other examples also, right? So, for example, if in your case you're arguing the moral imperative and health benefits, like from the CERI framework, alleviation of poverty, reducing stress, or from the economic aspect of economic stimulus, or poor spending all income and boosting local businesses, and future proofing. And this could look like automation of jobs and UBI becoming a buffer. What the likely case from the opposition side is that it can be an inflationary spiral where injection of capital can devalue the currency very much because people are like pushing a lot of money into the market. It could also mean that the labor market can collapse because the incentive to work is removed and essential jobs will be unfilled. And unsustainability could be that trillions could occur in new spending requiring massive tax hikes. What your rebuttals to argument one could be is that probably you could look at target stimulus as a economic model. You can, for argument two, for the labor market collapsing, look at different studies where people do have, or different countries in that example, where people do have universal basic income, but people's quality of life is actually improving, and people do not really drop in labor, and people do seek purpose. And the third one, for unsustainability of cost, you could say that reallocating existing subsidies could mean that you can have new tax models and new like shifting of burdens, which could not like create a lot more spending, but can create that buffer zone which is sweetly dealing with the issues that are likely to occur. You can here also quickly think about what can be their quick like rebuttals to your arguments. For example, for the first argument on moral imperative and health, you could say that it can become a moral hazard or where no right to others labors. You for argument 2 of economic stimulus, you could be arguing that stimulus is probably artificial and can only lead to creating like service jobs, which can be something which is broadly not good for the economy, because it would mean that there's a lot less like potential backdrop towards protectionism being beneficial. And to third argument, you could look at it being speculative, where retraining and other issues can be something much more beneficial in terms of considering automation. So you can see here from this table itself that there's a lot of potential for discussing the ins and outs of every like argument, and you can have like an unending like tussle between each of them. But this is somewhat of a structure which gives you a better narrative as to what to push during prep and what to prioritize during prep, but also what to like meaningfully engage with the opposition's case, and how to deal with things better and understand things better. Now, dealing with phase 3 is imperative, but also this is a team sport. So the last aspect that we'll probably be looking at is phase 4 of role allocation and structuring for team debates. There are certain debate formats, of course, where you're just speaking alone, like conventional debates. So this would not be that relevant for those formats. But for debates like British parliamentary, Asian parliamentary, where you're speaking as a team, it's much more important to consider these aspects where you have to prioritize what to say when and who is saying what. Now, if you have a very good case, but it's delivered like haphazardly or illogically, you will ironically lose, even if you have the best intentions, even if you think of yourself as the best of debaters or the best of people who are laying claim to what you are understanding or what you are capable of delivering, you will not be able to fundamentally justify all your claims and arguments that easily. Your structure in debate, therefore, is very paramount and important. You have to be very careful in terms of managing how you are going to go ahead and present your argumentation. This means that if there are three speakers in your team, I'll take an example of Asian parliamentary here. Your first speaker has to do the definitions, they have to do the modeling, they have to lay down the groundwork for the debate. The second speaker will have to come around and give more arguments, relay certain things which have been questioned by the opposition, and so on. There are certain roles which are very intrinsically driven by what that particular format needs you to do. And as an individual who is going that role, you have to ensure that you have fulfilled that particular role to the best capacity that you can to make it stand with leverage in terms of how you are being like looked at from the perspective of the judges sheet, and how the judges are looking at scoring you in terms of the debate and giving you credit for your cases. So you have to be very careful in understanding what kind of like paramount importance your particular positions have, but also in terms of like what kind of necessities and what kind of important aspects you need to cover. So I cannot go super in depth into particularly what each format would require for you, because that would mean that I'm discussing more about the format specific indices and what the speaker roles would mean instead of prep time itself. But you have to also prioritize this during prep time, because considering what material is to be presented when is the duty of the prep time. And that is also something that is very important to consider, because I have seen speakers where they have come around and presented material which would have been so much better if it would have just come around in terms of definitions or modeling, or in terms of like the first few arguments, because material that comes around too late sometimes can be discredited. For example, if you're doing new framing in WIP, it might not be allowed in terms of how the format perceives it. And I think that becomes a huge concern in terms of how you are presenting your argumentation as well. So you have to be very careful that you be by the book in terms of how you are structuring your speeches, but B also prioritize who is saying what in the prep time itself to not have any confusion and eradicate any scope of potential mistakes that might come around from it. So the last thing, and probably one of the more challenging aspects to crystallize in just normal like conversation and discussions around a workshop, is how to manage time or how to look at efficiency issues in terms of your prep time limits. Now, usually the time that you allocate for doing all of these steps is based on the amount of time in total that you have. For Asians, you have a lot more time. For British Parliament, you don't have that much time. There are certain like other nuances like closing teams and British parliamentary debates might not need to focus on like deconstruction at that time as much as they need to do in terms of depth of argumentation, because they need to be prioritizing extensions and uniqueness much more than, say, for example, defining terms, because they need to run with the definitions that come around from opening teams anyways. So there are certain nuances. We can't deal with all of those nuances in the time limit that we have, but also in terms of the slides that I have made. So I have highlighted those to you verbally, and I think those are some things that you will be considering when you're learning specific formats, and it would be something that would be more easier to you to come by when you're practicing those formats and discussing different things around formats and doing things in that sense. But just the general steps then as to what prep time management might look like and how to manage time effectively in order of how they are usually perceived. The first thing is deconstruction, which we already have discussed, where you're reading the motion, identifying the type of motion, defining terms, and agreeing on the burdens of proof. This should initially take like a few minutes at the start of the prep time, a minute or two. If you have more time, like in Asians, maybe a couple more minutes after that. The second is brainstorming on both sides. Use the PESTLE format that we've discussed, generate all the possible arguments from your side and their side as well, and think about what can be the critical fallacies you need to deal with to make your case more robust. Deal with the ideas that are coming from the other side to make clear cut considerations as to what are the necessary challenges and other aspects that you need to deal with. The third aspect is case selection and prioritization. From your brainstorming, select your strongest arguments, identifying the main clash points, and also dealing with issues that might come around from them trying to beat down on what your clash points and identified main arguments are. So consider what you can or cannot say possibly to your benefit and what would be probably better dealt with or not dealt with at that particular point of time, and consider moving along in that particular narrative and that sense. The fourth thing is argument and rebuttal constructions. Write the full CERI method for your 3 to 4 arguments. People have different ways of note taking and also structuring things in their sheet. So we are not discussing that, but you have to follow through, at least in your mind, how you're dealing with these things in the framework of CERI so that you have a more robust and complete argument in terms of how it is framed and in terms of how it is planned to be discussed. So once you're done with that, the next aspect that you will be dealing with is structuring and finalization. So once you have thought about your arguments, you've dealt with what can be the possible arguments from the other side, you have now thought about what kind of like issues or policy mandates could come around from your motions, and you've discussed what kind of like things that you're prioritizing in terms of arguments from all the arguments that you've tried to identify. You now structure it, you allocate speaker roles, finalize signposting, write what could be the start and end of your speeches and how you're dealing with different things, what should take priority in terms of presentation, what should take priority in terms of the order, and so on. And lastly, you go ahead and do the final check. Does every argument link back to the burden of proof? Does all of my arguments flow logically? Do all of my arguments flow in a natural state where one thing coming after the other makes more sense? Is my most important argument placed in the place where it is needed to go for it to make the most amount of impact in the debate? Once you've answered all of these 6 points about deconstruction, brainstorming, case selection and prioritization, argument and rebuttal construction, structuring and finalization, and final check, you are more or less ready to come out from prep time and go into your debate. So Just a quick reminder for the key considerations that we have discussed as part of this session. Follow the PESTLE format for argument generation: political, economic, social, technological, um, then environmental, legal, so on. And also follow the ARE and CWI methods for making sure that arguments are robustly constructed. Assertion, reasoning, example, claim, warrants, and impact. Making arguments follow the CERI principle of claims, evidence, explanations, and evidence, and analysis, as well as like reasoning and then your impacts. This would ensure that you have more robust time that you spend on creating meaningful arguments and selecting only the arguments that work best. Lastly, follow the six-step method that we discussed in terms of managing time, in terms of deconstruction, brainstorming, case selection, argument and rebuttal construction, structuring and finalization, and the final check. With all of that, you are more or less ready to take part in your next debate round and very well in terms of doing prep. If you have any questions, I will be happy to take them right now. If there are none, we will wrap up the session soon. Again, thank you so much for everybody who has attended and for all the people who are viewing on YouTube as well. Please do like, share, and subscribe. It helps us a lot in maintaining these free workshops for you and also creating new ones for you, which can help you in the future. Thank you again. I'll wait a couple of seconds for questions and we'll wrap up after that. Okay. So seeing that there are no questions, we'll be wrapping up the session. Again, thank you for everybody who is listening in to the video on YouTube, as well as people who are attending the workshop live. We are hosting workshops pretty frequently, so you can check out the workshop calendar that we have shared across with all of you to go ahead and sign up for the next workshop at any time. It's completely free and you can participate with your friends and everybody else as well. Do hit the like button, please share and subscribe so that this content can be maintained the way that it is, free and forever for all of you who are joining in. Thank you again and signing off. Thank you for having me on board. Take care, everybody. Have a good day, good evening, or good afternoon, wherever you're listening in from. Take care.